It was just another ordinary day for Emily Dawson, or so everyone thought. She slipped on her worn but reliable blue Postwoman uniform, the kind that had become as much a part of her as the air she breathed. The deep blue was faded in some places, but it fit her well, its simplicity hiding the truth of who she was. Emily walked out of her small apartment, adjusted the bag of letters and parcels slung over her shoulder, and headed down the street. Her delivery route was the same as always. A long, narrow street lined with neatly arranged houses. The kind of street where people barely noticed anything outside their windows. The lawns were trimmed, the streets clean, and the sky was always a shade of pale blue, even when the clouds rolled in. The scent of fresh grass lingered in the air, mixing with the faint smell of coffee wafting from the kitchen windows. It was the perfect picture of suburban life, where everyone kept to themselves, and the world moved at a steady pace. To the people on the street, Emily was just another face, another postwoman who appeared every day without fail. She was part of the background, just as unremarkable as the houses she passed. The homeowners didn't think much of her. She was the delivery girl, a stranger in their world. Some barely said hello as she handed over their mail, others just nodded and took the packages, before retreating into their homes. No one cared to know her name. They only saw the uniform, the bag of letters, the sound of her shoes on the pavement. But there was something about Emily that no one saw. Beneath that plain uniform and the serious look on her face, Emily carried a secret. It was a history that had been buried deep inside her for years, hidden from the world. A history that could change everything. Emily wasn't just any postwoman. She had a past that few could ever imagine. She had been someone. Someone important. But you wouldn't know it just by looking at her. She wasn't wearing medals or fancy clothes, and she wasn't at the center of any spotlight. The world didn't know who she was anymore. But she had once been at the top of her game, an Olympic gymnast, one of the best in the world. Once upon a time, Emily had stood on a podium, draped in gold. She had flipped and twisted her body with a grace that made people gasp, winning medals that symbolized years of hard work and sacrifice. At one point, she had been a household name. The young girl with the perfect backflip. The one who flew higher than everyone else. But that was before the world had moved on, before life had swept her away from the sport she loved, leaving her to search for something new. It wasn't that Emily had given up on gymnastics had given up on her. The injury had come too fast, too sudden, and it had stolen her future. And so, Emily had moved on. She'd taken a job as a postwoman, something simple and steady, something that wouldn't require her to remember the pain, the training, or the lost opportunities. At first, she had hated the job. The early mornings, the endless deliveries, the way people barely noticed her. It was as if she was invisible, nothing more than a shadow passing through their lives. But Emily had grown used to it. She'd learned how to ignore the whispers of the past. She had learned how to pretend that being ordinary didn't bother her, that being forgotten didn't hurt. And so, she went about her work, moving quietly through the streets, doing what was expected of her. It wasn't until the bikers came along that things began to change. Emily had always kept to herself. She didn't ask for attention. She didn't want to stand out. But in a neighborhood as quiet as this, it was hard not to notice the group of men who gathered at the corner cafe every afternoon. Their loud voices carried over the street, their laughter echoing through the air. They were hard to miss, tough-looking, covered in tattoos, wearing leather jackets, their motorcycles parked nearby, growling with power. At first, Emily didn't mind them. They didn't bother her, and she didn't bother them. But soon, it became clear that they didn't see her the way she saw herself. They didn't just notice her, they saw an easy target. It started with small things. A passing comment, a glance too long, a snide remark. Emily, keeping her eyes on her route, tried to ignore it. She had no time for trouble. But trouble, it seemed, had found her. There was Jake, the leader of the group, always the loudest, always the first to speak. His voice was like a whip cracking in the air. "Hey, you lost, lady," he'd shout as she passed. "Need a hand, or are you just delivering letters to your fans?" The other bikers would laugh, and the sound would sting in her chest. Emily's face remained impassive, her heart beating calmly in her chest. She knew better than to respond. Ignoring them was the only way to survive. But deep inside, a small part of her seethed. These men thought they could pick on her. They thought she was just another weak link in the neighborhood. And maybe, just maybe, that's what she had let them believe. But that was before the day everything would change. Every time Emily walked past them, their comments grew more brazen, more direct. It was as though the louder they were, the more they felt in control. They were all the same, loud, cocky, and used to getting what they wanted. They thought they could scare her, make her cower like they had done to so many before. And maybe, for a moment, she almost believed it. Maybe she almost thought they would break her. But then, she remembered something. Something from the past. Emily had lived a life where she had fought for everything. Where every medal had been hard-won, where every flip, every twist, every moment in the spotlight had come from years of sweat, blood, and tears. She had been broken before physically, mentally, but she had never stayed broken. No. She was not the weak postwoman they thought they saw. She was far from it. As Emily walked down the street on that ordinary day, she had no idea how much that simple moment would change everything. She had no idea that the bikers would make one last mistake. The mistake of underestimating her. The weight of the mailbag was light in her hands, but her mind was heavy with thoughts of what had happened, and what was to come. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone. She had nothing to prove. But they were going to learn who she really was. They were going to learn that beneath this uniform was someone who had never backed down in her life. Today, they would see her for who she truly was. Today, they would understand that Emily Dawson wasn't just any postwoman. She was a champion. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the street. The afternoon was drawing to a close, and the sounds of the neighborhood began to settle down. Birds chirped in the trees, and the occasional car passed by, but for the most part, everything was peaceful. Almost too peaceful. Emily reached the corner of the street, where she always had to pass by the cafe where the bikers gathered. She could see them from a distance, laughing, shouting, and acting like they owned the place. They were a rowdy bunch, enjoying their late afternoon break, their loud voices echoing across the street. Her eyes were fixed straight ahead, her pace steady and calm, though her mind was far from peaceful. The same thoughts kept running through her head, not today. Not again. She had been dealing with their taunts for weeks, always brushing them off as if they meant nothing. She had told herself that it wasn't worth her time, that it was just noise, but today, something inside her shifted. A small spark of anger lit up in her chest. It was the kind of anger that came from being disrespected, from being underestimated. It was the kind of anger that only built up after being poked at over and over again. Jake spotted her as soon as she turned the corner. His eyes lit up, and he nudged his friends. "Look who's here, guys. Our favorite little postwoman. You lost, sweetheart." His voice was loud and mocking, and his friends chuckled in agreement. Emily ignored him, focusing on her task. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of a response. But as she walked past them, Jake shouted again, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Hey, do a flip for us, Emily. Show us what that Olympic gold was really worth." His words were cruel, designed to provoke her, to remind her of something she had worked so hard to bury. He was taunting her, daring her to show him who she really was. The other bikers laughed, their voices growing louder as they egged Jake on. Emily could feel their eyes on her, and she could feel the weight of their judgment. But something was different now. She wasn't the same person who had walked past them every other day, quiet and silent, letting their words bounce off her. She had had enough. As she reached the corner of the cafe, something inside her snapped. She didn't know what made her stop, whether it was the last straw of their constant mocking or the memory of her glory days as an athlete, but she suddenly turned toward them, her body tense, her mind focused. The bikers froze as they saw the change in her stance. This wasn't the same woman they had laughed at before. This wasn't the same Emily. Jake's grin faltered as he took in the look on her face. There was something different in her eyes now. It was the kind of look someone had when they were ready to fight, ready to prove something. Emily stood tall, her posture straight and her gaze unwavering. She took a deep breath, as if preparing herself for what was about to come. Then, without warning, she moved. With a smooth, fluid motion, Emily lifted her arms and spun her body into the air, her legs kicking out in a perfect arc. The bikers didn't know what was happening at first, but by the time they realized, Emily had already performed a flawless backflip. The group fell silent, their eyes wide with shock. The sound of her landing was light but firm, like a cat landing on its feet. For a moment, the street was still. The only sound was the quiet whoosh of the wind, which seemed to freeze around them. Emily stood there for a second, breathing calmly, her hands resting at her sides. She could feel the eyes of the bikers on her, their stares full of disbelief. Jake was the first to break the silence. His mouth opened and closed, as if he couldn't find the right words. The other bikers were equally stunned, their grins replaced with confusion. "Did you just?" Jake finally asked, his voice faltering. Emily didn't answer him. She didn't need to. She had already said everything with her actions. She took a step forward, and the group of bikers shrank back slightly. The tension in the air was thick, and the power dynamics had shifted. Jake cleared his throat, trying to regain some of his bravado, but it was clear that the situation had caught him off guard. His tough exterior seemed to crack for just a moment. You're not just some delivery girl, are you?" he muttered, more to himself than to Emily. "No," Emily said quietly, but her voice carried. "I'm not." For a brief moment, there was nothing but silence. The bikers looked at each other, unsure of how to react. They had been so sure of themselves, so certain that Emily was just a weak, invisible postwoman, but now everything had changed. They had underestimated her, thinking she was nothing more than a person to push around. But they had no idea who they were messing with. Emily wasn't just any woman. She wasn't just some ordinary delivery girl. She had once been at the top of her sport, one of the best in the world. She had earned her place, and now, she was standing in front of them, showing them just a glimpse of the strength and skill she still possessed. The silence stretched on, the tension hanging in the air. Finally, Jake seemed to snap back into his role as the leader of the group. He cleared his throat, but his tone was less mocking now. All right, I get it," he said, trying to cover up his own unease. "You used to do gymnastics, huh? Big deal." Emily met his gaze, her eyes steady. "It's a big deal if you know what you're talking about. But I don't expect you to understand." Jake didn't know what to say. He had thought he could make fun of her, that he could break her down with a few words. But he hadn't counted on Emily having this side to her, this power, this history. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other, unsure of how to handle the situation. They had been expecting a fight, but instead, they had been met with something entirely different. Emily took a step back, her chest rising and falling steadily with each breath. She wasn't angry, not really. She was calm. Calm in the way someone was when they knew exactly what they were capable of, but also knew when to walk away. You think you can talk down to me because you're loud? Emily asked, her voice still steady. You think that makes you tough? She looked at them, one by one, each of their faces a mixture of confusion and reluctance. You don't know what tough is. Tough is getting back up after you fall. Tough is getting back on that beam after you miss your mark. Tough is pushing through pain, day after day, when everyone else says you should quit. There was a brief silence. The bikers stood frozen, unsure how to respond. Emily's words had cut deeper than any of them could have expected. She wasn't just talking about gymnastics. She was talking about life. And in that moment, they all knew it. Emily turned away, her head held high. She didn't need to say anything more. She had shown them who she was. And that was all that mattered. As she continued down the street, her heart was calm, her steps steady. The bikers didn't say another word. They didn't even dare to follow her. They had seen her power, and they knew better than to challenge it. Today, they had learned something they would never forget: never underestimate the quiet one. And as Emily walked away, she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't just the delivery girl anymore. She was Emily Dawson. And she was done being overlooked. It was a quiet neighborhood, the kind where the air always seemed to carry the scent of freshly mowed lawns and the hum of ordinary lives moving forward. People were busy, going about their daily routines, and everyone assumed that things here would always remain safe and predictable. The world outside these neatly trimmed fences seemed far away. The street had a peaceful rhythm, where the sound of children playing in the yards blended with the soft clink of garden tools and the occasional chirp of a bird. But, hidden beneath the calm surface, trouble was quietly brewing. And it came in the form of a group of rowdy bikers who had made the corner cafe their hangout. Every afternoon, without fail, they gathered there. Their motorcycles roared as they pulled into the parking lot, the sound of their engines cutting through the peaceful hum of the neighborhood. They were loud. They were reckless. And most importantly, they were always looking for something or someone to pick on. Emily Dawson had lived in the area for some time now. She knew the bikers, or at least, she knew of them. Their reputation was hard to ignore. They weren't the kind of men who cared for rules, or for anyone who might challenge their way of life. They reveled in their loud, boisterous personalities, their rough leather jackets and tattoos, and their constant need to make their presence known. To them, the world was their playground, and the people in it, their entertainment. For the most part, Emily had learned to ignore them. She had her job to focus on, and they were nothing more than a background noise in her routine. Every day, she delivered the letters, packages, and small reminders of daily life, never pausing to take much notice of the bikers. They would glare at her as she walked by, making crude jokes and sneering in her direction. She kept her head down, made her deliveries, and tried her best to avoid engaging with them. But today was different. As Emily walked down the street, she could feel the eyes of the bikers on her. It wasn't the usual disinterested, dismissive stares she had grown accustomed to. No, this was different. Today, there was something sharper, something more predatory in their gazes. As she passed the corner cafe, she noticed them, their wide grins, their harsh laughter, the way they all seemed to turn toward her as if they had just spotted a new target. And she realized, with a sinking feeling in her chest, that today was not going to be a normal day. She kept her pace steady, hoping they would lose interest, hoping they would turn back to whatever they had been doing before. But Emily knew better. She had seen enough to know when things were about to get ugly. Jake, the leader of the group, was always the first to speak. Jake was tall, broad-shouldered, and intimidating, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of stone. His dark hair was wild and untamed, his beard thick and scruffy. He had a way about him, a kind of arrogance that made people shrink away. And now, it seemed that he had decided Emily was his next target. "Hey, little lady." Jake's voice boomed, deep and rough. It sliced through the quiet air, carrying across the street like a loud bell. You lost or something? Or are you just trying to be one of the boys? The others laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. Their laughter bounced off the walls of the cafe, sending a chill down Emily's spine. They were all staring at her now, their eyes filled with amusement and the kind of disdain that made her blood boil. Emily gritted her teeth but didn't respond. She kept walking, her pace quickening, her heart pounding. Jake wasn't going to let it go. He nudged one of his friends, a tall, skinny guy with a nose ring, and said something in his ear. The friend laughed, clearly enjoying the show. Then Jake called out again, his voice louder this time, more mocking. "Come on, Postwoman," he yelled, his words laced with sarcasm. "What's the matter? Too shy to talk? Or are you just too busy to stop and chat with the guys? Don't tell me you're just here to work. I bet you're looking for some fun, huh?" The other bikers laughed again, their voices growing louder, more brazen. One of them, a short guy with a leather vest covered in patches, yelled, "Hey, don't be shy, sweetheart. We don't bite." His words were playful, but there was a dangerous edge to them, a kind of threat hidden behind the grin on his face. Emily's fists clenched at her sides. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, the old anger she had kept buried for so long bubbling up to the surface. She had never liked being underestimated. She had never liked the feeling of being dismissed as nothing more than a target. But she had learned how to cope with it. She had learned how to ignore the comments and keep moving, keep doing her job, no matter how much it irritated her. But today was different. Today, there was something inside her that refused to be quiet. Something that told her she had had enough. She could feel their eyes on her, feel their judgment and their amusement. They thought she was nothing. They thought she was weak. They thought they could push her around, just like they had done to so many others before her. But they had no idea who they were messing with. Emily could still remember the years she had spent on the gymnastics mat, training, pushing herself past every limit. She could still remember the grueling hours, the endless practices, the sweat and tears that had gone into becoming the best. She remembered the sacrifices, the moments when she could have quit but didn't. The pain she had endured, and the victories she had achieved. She had never been weak. Emily's steps faltered for just a second, but it was enough to grab Jake's attention. He leaned against the cafe's brick wall, his arms crossed, a smug smile on his face. "What's the matter, princess? Can't handle a little fun? You're not so tough after all, are you?" He raised an eyebrow, looking her up and down, like she was something beneath him. Like she was just another person to make fun of. The group of bikers watched eagerly, clearly entertained by Emily's discomfort. They didn't understand. They didn't know who she was. They didn't know what she had been through. And Emily was done pretending she didn't care. She stopped in her tracks. The voices of the bikers seemed to fall away, drowned out by the rush of adrenaline in her veins. She turned slowly to face them, her eyes narrowing with quiet fury. "Do you really think you can get away with this?" she asked, her voice calm but steady. There was a certain coldness in her tone, something that made the bikers pause, just for a moment. Jake blinked, caught off guard by the change in her demeanor. "What's your problem?" he asked, though his bravado was beginning to waver. Emily took a step forward, her gaze never leaving his. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, but she didn't care. "My problem," she said slowly, "is people like you. People who think they can make other people feel small, just because they're bigger, louder, and more arrogant." The bikers were silent now, unsure of how to respond. Emily could see the shift in their expressions, the flicker of uncertainty behind their tough exteriors. But it didn't matter. She wasn't going to back down anymore. She took another step forward, her fists now relaxed at her sides. I'm not the one you want to mess with, she continued, her voice low but steady. You think you know me. You think you can pick on me because I'm just some quiet postwoman. But you don't know who I am. You don't know what I've been through. For a moment, the bikers exchanged uneasy glances. Jake opened his mouth, but no words came out. They were all waiting for him to say something, to reclaim control of the situation. But Emily had already taken the power. Jake pushed himself off the wall, his face darkening. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially by someone like Emily. But this time, he wasn't going to back down either. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Emily could feel it, could feel the storm building up around them. And in that moment, she knew something had changed. The quiet postwoman was gone. The woman standing before them now was someone who wasn't afraid to fight back. The standoff stretched on, each second feeling heavier than the last. The street seemed quieter now, as though the world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Emily stood firm, her posture tall and confident, a quiet storm building in her chest. The bikers, still unsure of how to react, shifted uneasily on their feet. Jake, the leader of the group, seemed to be struggling with how to regain control of the situation. Normally, he would have laughed it off, made another rude comment, and his friends would have followed suit. But there was something different about Emily. She wasn't scared. She wasn't backing down. And that made him uncomfortable. Jake took a step forward, his boots thudding heavily against the pavement. You think you can intimidate me with that tough girl act, he sneered, his voice low and dangerous. You really think I'm scared of some little postwoman who's got a chip on her shoulder? Emily didn't flinch. She held her ground, her eyes locked onto his. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the harsh judgment in his words, but she wasn't going to let it break her. She had faced worse, much worse, and survived. You don't know anything about me, Emily said, her voice steady and clear. But you will. Soon enough, you'll learn exactly who you're dealing with. The bikers, who had been circling around the scene like sharks, paused at her words. There was a strange power in her calmness, something that made them pause. Jake wasn't used to this kind of resistance. He had seen people cower before him, beg him to stop, apologize, and just get out of his way. But Emily didn't beg. She didn't apologize. She wasn't going anywhere. For a moment, it seemed as if the world had frozen, the tension so thick it could be sliced with a knife. The sound of a motorcycle engine revved in the distance, but it barely registered as Jake stared at Emily, his face twisted in a mixture of confusion and rage. You're not like the others, are you? Jake muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing. Not afraid. You think you're special, huh? Emily shook her head slowly. I don't think I'm special. But I've had enough of being underestimated. You don't know who I am, or what I've been through. You picked the wrong person to mess with today. Jake clenched his fists, his temper rising. But Emily wasn't finished. She knew she needed to keep the pressure on, to make sure they didn't just walk away thinking this was some weak moment in her life. She wasn't weak. She never had been. You think you're tough because you ride motorcycles and wear leather jackets, she said, her voice rising now, strong and confident. I've been through things you couldn't even imagine, things that would break most people. But here I am. Standing. Unbroken. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. Emily could see the doubt creeping in. The image they had of her as a harmless postwoman, just a woman walking by in a uniform, was cracking. Slowly, they were starting to realize that she wasn't just another person they could walk all over. One of the bikers, a younger guy with messy hair and a crooked smile, shifted nervously on his bike. Maybe we should just go, he muttered, his voice barely audible. This isn't worth it. Jake shot him a look, his eyes narrowing. "Shut up," he barked, but the hesitation in his voice was clear. There was a shift happening, something he couldn't ignore. He was starting to see that Emily wasn't just an easy target. She wasn't someone to be mocked or belittled. But the damage had already been done. The bikers had crossed a line. And Emily wasn't about to let them off so easily. Without warning, Emily took a step forward, her eyes now burning with intensity. "You think you can just pick on people and get away with it?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with an unmistakable authority. "That's not how this works. Not anymore." Jake's face twisted into a sneer. "What are you going to do about it?" he challenged, stepping closer, his chest puffed out like he was daring her to make a move. Emily didn't flinch. She had faced bullies before. She had been told she wasn't good enough, that she would never make it, that she wasn't cut out for greatness. But she had proven everyone wrong. And she wasn't about to back down now. "You're going to learn something today, Jake," Emily said calmly, her gaze unwavering. "You're going to learn that respect isn't something you can just demand. It's something you earn. And right now, you haven't earned a damn thing." For the first time, Jake faltered. His smirk wavered. The rest of the bikers shifted uncomfortably, their confidence beginning to crack under the weight of Emily's words. The power was shifting. They were no longer the ones holding all the cards. Emily had taken control of the situation, and now it was their turn to react. "Come on, Jake, let's just go," the younger biker muttered again, looking nervously at the others. He could see that the situation was getting tense, and he wasn't sure if they were really going to push things further. But Jake wasn't ready to admit defeat. "Not yet. Don't think this is over," he growled, trying to maintain his authority. He turned to his friends, giving them a look that said, "Stay with me on this." But his words lacked the usual conviction. The bikers were no longer sure if they wanted to keep going. They had been ready to have some fun at Emily's expense, but now they were starting to understand that there were consequences to their actions. Emily wasn't some weak target. She was a force, and they had misjudged her. Without another word, Emily turned on her heel and continued on her route, her pace slow but steady, her head held high. The bikers watched her go, their faces filled with a mix of confusion, anger, and reluctant respect. Jake stood still, his fists still clenched at his sides, but the fire that had burned so brightly moments ago was now dimming. He had been challenged. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't have all the answers. As Emily walked away, she couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. She hadn't backed down. She hadn't let them make her feel small. She had stood her ground. And in doing so, she had sent a message. A message that would resonate far beyond this moment. And as she disappeared around the corner, the bikers stood there, silent. The conflict wasn't over yet, but it had been given a new twist, a new perspective. They had underestimated her, and now they would have to face the consequences of that mistake. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, the tension in the neighborhood grew thicker. Emily continued her daily rounds, moving with quiet determination as the bikers became more brazen. Jake and his gang seemed to sense something was different about her, something they couldn't quite understand. Their taunts became louder, more personal. "Watch out, the Olympic postwoman's coming." Jake's voice rang out one afternoon, full of mockery. His words echoed across the street, causing a few heads to turn. His gang laughed behind him, enjoying the show. It was clear they wanted to break her spirit, to make her feel small. But Emily didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that words were often the easiest weapons to ignore. In her past life, in the gymnastic arenas, she had endured far worse from people who didn't believe in her: critics, coaches, and even other athletes. Their harsh words were nothing compared to the physical pain she had pushed through during her training. Still, Jake's jeers hit her differently. They were like little knives, trying to prick at her past. Her Olympic past. A past she had buried deep inside her for years. Each time Jake made a jab, Emily felt the anger building again, just beneath the surface. It was the kind of anger she hadn't let herself feel since she walked away from her career as a gymnast. She had buried it beneath years of living a quiet life, walking the same streets every day, delivering packages with a smile. But deep down, she knew who she was. She had always known. Her heart was still that of a champion. That fire hadn't gone out. It had just been dormant for a while. And now, as the bikers' mockery grew worse, that fire was slowly starting to rekindle. "Come on, Olympic star, show us some flips," Jake shouted one afternoon, his voice loud and taunting. "Or are you too busy with that boring postwoman job to remember how to flip?" The other bikers hooted with laughter. But Emily didn't respond. She simply kept walking, her eyes fixed ahead. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, the urge to turn around and shut him down with one sharp remark, but she fought it. Emily had worked too hard to get to where she was, to let this petty harassment derail her. She had spent years fighting in the gym, perfecting routines, enduring hours of pain and sweat, all for a single moment of triumph. She had once been the best, an Olympic gold medalist. The realization hit her hard. The reason she hadn't fought back wasn't because she was afraid. It was because she was trying to forget. She had buried her past in the hopes of living a simple life. But now, those taunts were dragging her back to who she truly was. Emily Dawson, the gymnast. The gold medalist. The woman who had learned how to rise after every fall, who had faced the highest pressures and came out on top. The bikers, of course, had no idea about any of this. To them, Emily was just another postwoman, a person they could laugh at and belittle. They didn't know the strength she carried, the resilience that had been honed over years of competition. But Mrs. Jensen, the coffee shop owner, noticed. She had been watching Emily every day as she walked by, delivering packages without saying a word, her face always focused, her back straight. She had seen how the bikers treated Emily, how they tried to break her. And Mrs. Jensen couldn't help but admire the young woman. "You're tougher than you look, Emily," Mrs. Jensen said one morning when Emily stopped by for her usual coffee. There was a hint of admiration in the older woman's voice. "Those boys don't know what they're messing with." Emily gave a small smile, her lips curling slightly at the edges. She didn't need anyone's pity. Mrs. Jensen meant well, but Emily didn't want to be seen as a victim. Still, the kind words were a small comfort. She nodded at the coffee shop owner, her eyes flickering for a moment as she thought of her past the Olympic podium, the roar of the crowd, the thrill of victory. The truth was, Emily was starting to feel something stir inside her, something she had kept buried for so long. The anger, the frustration, the need for justice, it was all coming back. Every taunt, every sneer from Jake and his gang, was a reminder of what she used to be and what she had let go of. They wanted to tear her down, but what they didn't realize was that they were only helping her rebuild. The weeks passed, and the taunts didn't stop. Every day, as she walked down the street, Emily would hear Jake's voice ringing in her ears, mocking her, laughing at her. But instead of breaking her down, it fueled her. She was no longer just the postwoman. She was a force. A force that had been trained to perform under pressure, to rise above the noise, to face adversity head-on. She began to change. She started walking a little taller, a little stronger. The quiet determination in her step became more pronounced. People who had seen her before, delivering packages day after day, started to notice. They began to see the change, the subtle shift in her demeanor. Mrs. Jensen wasn't the only one who saw it. Other neighbors, too, started to take note. They noticed how Emily never responded to the bikers' jeers, how she remained calm and composed despite the verbal attacks. Some of them even began to admire her. The quiet strength she exuded was magnetic. They knew she was no ordinary woman. But Emily wasn't just walking taller physically. Inside, her confidence was growing. She had been running from her past for so long, but now, with every passing day, she was realizing that her past didn't define her, it had shaped her. And maybe it was time to let the world see who she really was. One day, as Emily was walking down her usual route, she noticed something new. The bikers, who had been relentless in their teasing, weren't laughing anymore. They were still there, still hanging out by the corner cafe, but there was a new energy in the air. The usual bravado Jake had carried with him was gone. It wasn't fear. It was something else. Respect, perhaps. Or maybe it was just the beginning of realizing that Emily wasn't someone they could mess with. They still called out to her, but their words had changed. They weren't as biting, not as sharp as they once were. "Hey, Olympic gold medalist," Jake called out one afternoon, his tone still mocking but with less venom. "How's the delivery business treating you?" Emily didn't turn to respond. She kept walking, but there was a flicker in her eyes, a spark of defiance. She wasn't going to let him get to her. Not anymore. She knew who she was. She had always known. And it wasn't just about delivering packages anymore. It was about delivering a message. The days rolled on, and the bikers' antics showed no signs of stopping. Every encounter felt like a test, pushing Emily closer to a breaking point she wasn't sure she could hold back much longer. But what they didn't realize was that every cruel word, every mocking laugh, was sharpening something deep within her, something she thought she had left behind for good. One chilly morning, Emily adjusted her postal bag and started her usual route. The familiar weight of the mail sat comfortably on her shoulder, a steady reminder of the life she had built after leaving her gymnastics career. She moved with precision and balance, her steps measured and purposeful. As she approached Maple Street, she noticed a new level of hostility radiating from the bikers. Their eyes locked onto her with unsettling intensity. Jake, the self-proclaimed leader, leaned against his motorcycle, a predatory grin stretched across his face. "Hey, Postwoman," he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "You still playing delivery girl, or have you decided to join the circus where you belong?" His gang burst into laughter, their voices echoing across the street like a sinister chorus. Emily clenched her jaw but kept walking. She was used to his taunts by now. But something about today felt different, more charged, more personal. Jake wasn't done. He stepped into her path, forcing her to stop. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue," he sneered. "Or maybe you think you're too good for us." Emily met his gaze, her expression calm but her mind racing. She couldn't afford to escalate things, not yet. Without a word, she sidestepped him and continued her route, her eyes never leaving the path ahead. But as she walked away, she could hear Jake muttering something under his breath, something that sounded like a promise of trouble to come. That evening, Emily found herself replaying the encounter over and over. She sat in her small, cozy apartment, staring out the window as rain pattered softly against the glass. Her gold medals, carefully stored in a wooden box under her bed, seemed to weigh heavier in her mind than they ever had before. She hadn't touched them in years, hadn't even allowed herself to think about the life she once lived. But now, memories came rushing back, the intense training sessions, the endless competitions, the victories won through sheer determination. Why had she left it all behind? Why had she let her past become a secret instead of a source of strength? The next day, Emily woke with renewed clarity. The fire inside her was burning brighter now, impossible to ignore. As she tied her shoes and adjusted her postal uniform, she caught her reflection in the mirror. There was something different about her today, something fierce, unstoppable. Later that afternoon, Emily made her rounds as usual. She was halfway through her deliveries when she spotted Jake and his gang gathered near the old gas station. They were arguing loudly, their frustration evident. One of their motorcycles had broken down, leaving them stranded and fuming. Emily hesitated for a moment, considering her options. She could ignore them and continue on her way, or she could confront them, on her terms, for the first time. Before she could overthink it, her feet were already moving. She walked straight toward them, her posture confident, her eyes locked on Jake. "Need some help?" she asked calmly, her voice steady and clear. The bikers turned, stunned into silence. Jake recovered quickly, sneering as usual. "What do you know about fixing bikes, postwoman?" he spat. "Stick to delivering letters." Emily shrugged, unfazed. "Suit yourself." As she turned to leave, she heard one of the bikers mumble, "Maybe she's not as weak as we thought." Jake's expression hardened. He didn't like losing control, not of his gang, and certainly not of the situation. Over the next week, the bikers became more aggressive, determined to push Emily past her limits. They blocked her path, knocked over her packages, and hurled insults with increasing venom. They were testing her, daring her to react. But Emily stayed composed, each encounter strengthening her resolve. She trained quietly in her apartment at night, push-ups, stretches, balancing exercises. Her body remembered the routines, the muscle memory still sharp despite the years away from the spotlight. One particularly rough afternoon, Jake and his gang cornered her near the old park. He stepped forward, his voice low and threatening. "You think you're tough, don't you? Just because you walk around like you own the place." Emily met his gaze without flinching. "I don't think I'm tough," she said quietly. "I know I am." The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the shift in her energy. For the first time, Jake seemed genuinely uncertain, but only for a moment. His ego wouldn't let him back down. "Prove it," he challenged, stepping closer. "Right here. Right now." Before Emily could respond, a familiar voice called out from behind them. "Emily." It was Mrs. Jensen, standing near the coffee shop's front steps with a protective look on her face. "Is everything all right?" Emily nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving Jake. "Everything's fine." Jake smirked. "Looks like you've got fans." But Emily didn't care about his comments anymore. She was done playing small. She was done pretending she didn't have the strength to stand up for herself. As she walked away, leaving the bikers speechless, she realized something important: she wasn't running from her past anymore. She was embracing it. The fire inside her was fully lit now. And soon, they would see exactly what that meant. The street fell into stunned silence. The bikers, who had spent weeks mocking Emily, now stood frozen, jaws slack. They had expected a timid retreat, not a breathtaking aerial display that seemed ripped straight from an action movie. Jake blinked, his mind struggling to reconcile the woman he had belittled with the fierce, powerful figure now standing before him. The confidence radiating from Emily wasn't just bravado, it was earned through years of discipline, grit, and world-class competition. "Is this some kind of trick?" Jake growled, stepping forward. His voice faltered slightly, betraying his shaken composure. Emily didn't budge. "No trick," she said evenly. "But you've been playing games for too long. Time to see how tough you really are." The bikers exchanged uncertain glances, but Jake, driven by pride and anger, couldn't back down, not in front of his crew. He clenched his fists, cracking his knuckles menacingly. "You think you're special just because you can jump around?" Emily allowed herself a small, knowing smile. "You have no idea." Before Jake could react, Emily sprang into motion. In one fluid move, she sprinted toward a nearby bench, planting her hands on its edge and launching herself into a powerful handspring. Her body twisted mid-air, landing squarely behind him. The bikers gasped. They had seen plenty of street fights but nothing like this. Jake spun around, startled and enraged, swinging a heavy punch. But Emily was already moving, her reflexes honed to perfection. She ducked under his arm with ease, executing a perfect backflip that landed her several feet away. "That all you got?" she taunted, her voice steady but fierce. Jake roared, charging toward her again. Emily sidestepped effortlessly, sweeping her leg in a low arc that knocked him off balance. He hit the ground hard, cursing under his breath as he scrambled back up. For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. He wasn't just losing, he was being outclassed in every way. Seeing their leader struggle, the other bikers hesitated, unsure of what to do. They were used to being the ones in control, but Emily was rewriting the rules. Desperation pushed two of them to rush toward her from opposite sides. Emily's mind was already calculating. With lightning speed, she vaulted onto a nearby picnic table, gaining the high ground. As one biker lunged, she leapt into the air, performing a flawless front tuck that sent her sailing over his outstretched arms. Before he could recover, she landed behind him and spun into a sweeping kick that sent him sprawling. The second biker, still charging, found himself on the receiving end of a sharp elbow strike as Emily twisted mid-air with gymnast-like precision. Breathing heavily, Jake rose once more, fury and humiliation etched into his face. He grabbed a heavy chain from his motorcycle, swinging it threateningly. Emily's eyes narrowed. She could see his movements clearly predictable, clumsy compared to the disciplined opponents she'd faced in her gymnastics days. Jake lunged, swinging the chain with all his strength. Emily jumped into a split leap, soaring gracefully over the whirling metal. As she landed, she twisted into a spinning kick that struck Jake's wrist, forcing him to drop the chain with a metallic clang. Before he could react, she advanced, flipping forward into a controlled handstand that let her lock her legs around his neck in a powerful scissor hold. With a sharp twist, she sent him crashing to the ground, winded and defeated. Jake groaned, gasping for air as he tried to push himself up, but Emily was already standing over him, steady and composed. "You're done," she said firmly. "This street doesn't belong to you anymore." The remaining bikers helped Jake to his feet, exchanging fearful, uncertain glances. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and they knew it. "This isn't over," Jake rasped, though the defeat in his voice was unmistakable. "It was over the moment you underestimated me," Emily countered, her gaze unyielding. As the bikers retreated, the street slowly came back to life. Doors opened, and neighbors cautiously stepped outside, having witnessed the entire confrontation. Mrs. Jensen hurried over, her eyes wide with amazement. "Emily. I had no idea," she whispered. Emily shrugged, breathing steadily despite the intense encounter. "I never wanted anyone to know." "You didn't just stand up for yourself," Mrs. Jensen said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You stood up for all of us." That night, Emily returned home, her body sore but her spirit lighter than it had been in years. She pulled out the old wooden box from beneath her bed, brushing dust from its worn edges. Inside lay her gold medals, glinting softly in the dim light. For the first time in a long time, she smiled not with nostalgia, but with acceptance. Her past wasn't something to hide or run from. It was her strength, her identity. She carefully hung one of the medals on the wall, a quiet reminder of who she was and what she could overcome. The next morning, as she set out on her usual delivery route, heads turned but this time with admiration and respect. Emily was no longer just the postwoman. She was a symbol of resilience, someone who refused to be defined by others' expectations. And as she walked down the familiar street, her steps light and confident, she couldn't help but smile. Because she knew one thing for certain. Sometimes, the quietest person in the room has the loudest story to tell and the strength to change everything. The street buzzed with energy, conversations breaking out among neighbors who had witnessed the incredible showdown. Emily could feel their curious stares but kept her focus straight ahead. She had never fought for recognition, only for respect. The bikers had disappeared, leaving behind a broken chain, scattered helmets, and bruised egos. Emily exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain from her shoulders. It was over, at least for now. Mrs. Jensen, still trembling with shock, approached cautiously. "Emily, are you okay?" she asked gently. Emily nodded. "I'm fine." "That was unreal," Mrs. Jensen whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You could have been hurt." "I've faced worse," Emily replied simply, glancing at the empty street. "They won't bother us again, not after today." News of the encounter spread quickly through the neighborhood. By the next morning, people exchanged stories over fences and in coffee shops. "Did you hear what she did? Took down Jake and his gang all by herself. Who knew she was an Olympian?" Emily tried to resume her usual deliveries, but everywhere she went, she was met with awe and gratitude. Little kids pointed excitedly when she passed by. Teenagers stared, amazed by her athletic prowess. Even the gruff old mechanic on Elm Street, who never spoke much, gave her a respectful nod. Still, Emily remained humble, deflecting praise with quiet grace. She had never fought for glory, only to remind herself she still had strength in her. But the peace wouldn't last. Far from the prying eyes of the neighborhood, Jake nursed his bruised pride in a dimly lit garage. His crew sat around in sullen silence, the sting of defeat still fresh. The humiliation burned deeper than any injury he'd suffered. "This isn't over," Jake snarled, slamming his fist onto the metal workbench, making tools rattle. His face was twisted with anger. "No one makes a fool out of me." One of the younger bikers, wary of Jake's temper, hesitated before speaking. "Boss, maybe we should let it go. She's different." Jake's glare could have melted steel. "Different? She's just a delivery girl who got lucky." The room stayed deathly silent. Jake's pride wouldn't allow him to admit the truth that he'd been outmatched. But his mind was already working, plotting his revenge. Meanwhile, Emily found herself unable to shake the feeling that something was coming. The fight had been a statement, but she knew men like Jake didn't take humiliation lightly. She had seen that same stubbornness in competitors who couldn't accept defeat, the ones who trained past exhaustion just to prove they were the best. As she sat in her modest living room that evening, her fingers brushed against an old photo on the mantel. It showed her younger self, beaming with joy, clutching her Olympic gold medal. Her coaches stood proudly behind her. She remembered what they used to tell her after every competition: "You faced the toughest challenges in the world. Don't let fear control you." Her gaze hardened. She wouldn't live in fear, not now, not ever. 2 days later, Emily's instincts proved right. During her morning route, she noticed something off, a strange stillness in the air, the kind that prickled at her senses. She glanced around, alert, but saw nothing unusual. Then she heard it, a distant rumble, like thunder rolling in. Her heart tightened as she recognized the sound. Motorcycles. Before she could react, 6 roaring bikes emerged from a side street, blocking her path. The engines idled threateningly as Jake dismounted, his expression cold and calculated. This time, he wasn't here to taunt. "Miss me?" he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. Emily stood her ground, calm but ready. "Thought you'd be too embarrassed to show your face again." Jake smirked darkly. "You humiliated me in front of my crew. I'm here to settle the score, for good." The bikers spread out, surrounding her. They weren't looking for a fair fight, they were out for revenge. Before anyone could move, Emily sprang into action. She sprinted toward a nearby wall and used it as a springboard, launching into a powerful backflip that landed her behind the nearest biker. Her elbow struck the back of his neck, dropping him instantly. Another biker lunged, swinging a metal bat. Emily twisted gracefully, grabbing his wrist and flipping him over her shoulder with flawless precision. He hit the pavement with a groan. Jake watched, seething with frustration. "Get her," he barked. 3 more bikers charged, but Emily was already moving like a force of nature. She leapt onto a parked car, using its roof as a platform for a spinning kick that knocked one biker off his feet. Her acrobatics turned the street into her arena, every movement calculated and powerful. Finally, it was just Jake left standing. His men lay scattered, groaning, and defeated. He grabbed a crowbar from his bike, gripping it tightly. "This ends now," he growled. Emily met his gaze without flinching. "Yes. It does." Jake lunged with a fierce swing, but Emily sidestepped, catching his arm mid-swing and twisting it back. He roared in pain but didn't surrender. He managed to break free, swinging again, but she dodged, countering with a sharp roundhouse kick that sent the crowbar flying from his hand. Disarmed and gasping for air, Jake dropped to his knees, finally realizing he was beaten. Breathing heavily, Emily stood over him. "Stay down," she warned. For the first time, Jake didn't argue. He knew this fight was over. As sirens wailed in the distance, the bikers scrambled to flee, leaving Jake behind. Neighbors rushed out, cheering and clapping. Emily felt an unexpected wave of relief, not just because she had won, but because she finally let herself be seen for who she truly was. Mrs. Jensen hugged her tightly. "You're a hero, Emily." Emily smiled faintly. "I'm just someone who doesn't back down." Life slowly returned to normal, but now, Emily walked her route with pride, no longer hiding her past. She wasn't just a postwoman, she was a champion, a protector, and a symbol of resilience. And the neighborhood knew one thing for sure. Underestimating Emily Dawson was the biggest mistake anyone could ever make. The street lay still in the aftermath of the confrontation, the bikers stunned into silence. Emily's unwavering stance left no room for doubt. She was done being anyone's target. Jake's bravado crumbled under the weight of his bruised ego and battered body. His crew shuffled nervously, exchanging uncertain glances. They were used to Jake being untouchable, but now, he looked shaken, humbled in a way they'd never seen before. "Get the bikes," Jake muttered, barely meeting Emily's eyes. His voice lacked its usual arrogance. It was the tone of someone who knew the fight was over and that he'd lost. The bikers scrambled to comply, engines roaring as they prepared to leave. Jake lingered a moment longer, clenching his fists as if considering one last attempt. But Emily's sharp, determined gaze pinned him in place. She didn't need words, her silence spoke louder than any threat. Finally, he mounted his bike and sped off, his tires screeching in retreat. As the dust settled, doors creaked open, and curious neighbors cautiously emerged. They had seen the confrontation through their windows, too frightened to intervene but now filled with awe. Mrs. Jensen hurried over, breathless and still stunned by what she'd witnessed. "Emily, are you all right?" she asked, her voice thick with concern. Emily nodded, adjusting her uniform like it was just another day on the job. "I'm fine, Mrs. Jensen." "You were incredible," the older woman gushed. "I knew you were strong, but that was something else." Others began gathering around, murmuring in amazement. Kids who had once watched Emily from afar now stared at her with wide-eyed admiration. "You really were an Olympic gymnast?" one boy asked hesitantly. Emily smiled gently. "I was, but today wasn't about gymnastics." Word of Emily's triumph spread through the entire neighborhood by sunset. Strangers approached her throughout the day, offering thanks, compliments, and even small gifts. Someone left flowers on her porch with a simple note, "Thank you for standing up for all of us." Even the gruff old mechanic from down the street, known for his quiet ways, managed a respectful nod when Emily passed by. But Emily didn't bask in the attention. She hadn't fought for recognition, she fought because it was the right thing to do. Every challenge she'd faced on the mats and in life had prepared her for that moment. Meanwhile, things weren't going well for Jake. His crew had scattered, unwilling to follow a leader who'd been so thoroughly defeated. Rumors of the fight spread beyond the neighborhood, reaching people who had once feared Jake's gang. His reputation, once built on intimidation, crumbled like sand under a rising tide. Even the police got involved after neighbors came forward, reporting months of harassment and threats. With no one left to back him up, Jake found himself answering hard questions, his past deeds catching up with him at last. Facing fines, community service, and a court date, Jake realized there was no escaping the consequences of his actions, not this time. Late that evening, Emily sat quietly on her front porch, her gaze fixed on the star-filled sky. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly at peace. The fight was over, not just with the bikers, but with the part of herself she'd kept hidden for so long. She thought back to her days as a competitive gymnast, where every routine ended with a final pose, an unmistakable symbol of victory. Life didn't come with neat endings like that, but today felt close. The next morning, Emily resumed her delivery route. Her steps were lighter, her spirit stronger. The familiar streets no longer felt hostile, they felt like home. Neighbors waved warmly, offering kind words, but Emily stayed humble, responding with quiet smiles. At the last house on her route, she found a package addressed to her. Puzzled, she opened it carefully. Inside was a framed photograph of her Olympic winning moment, accompanied by a handwritten note. "Thank you for reminding us what true strength looks like. You inspire us all." Emily's eyes glistened with emotion. She had never sought recognition, but knowing she had made a difference touched her deeply. She placed the photo on her mantle, next to her medal, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that even after the biggest challenges, life always offered another chance to rise. The days that followed were calmer, filled with warmth and gratitude from those who had witnessed her courage. Emily continued her work as she always had, but with a new sense of purpose. She wasn't just the postwoman anymore. She was a protector, a symbol of resilience, and a quiet force of nature that no one would dare underestimate again. The neighborhood had changed, but more importantly, so had Emily. She had reclaimed her strength, her spirit, and her place in the world, not as a forgotten champion, but as someone who never stopped fighting for what was right. Because sometimes, life's toughest battles aren't fought in front of cheering crowds but in the quiet streets where courage shines brightest. The sun rose over the quiet neighborhood, casting a golden glow on the familiar streets. For the first time in what felt like forever, the air was still calm and peaceful. The rumble of motorcycle engines was nowhere to be heard. Emily woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside her window. She stretched, feeling lighter, as if a burden she had carried for too long had finally been lifted. Her uniform was neatly folded, ready for another day on the job. Today felt different, better. There was no apprehension about crossing the street where the bikers usually gathered. They were gone, and with them, the oppressive weight of fear. As Emily started her delivery route, she noticed something unusual at her first stop, a small box resting on the porch with a bright red bow. Her name was written neatly on the tag. Curious, she opened it and found a card inside. "For standing tall when no one else could. Thank you, Emily. You're our hero." Tears prickled her eyes. The gesture was simple but deeply meaningful. She tucked the card carefully into her bag, a quiet smile touching her lips. As Emily walked down the street, she noticed the small changes. Doors that were once closed were now open, neighbors chatting warmly with one another. It was as if her stand against the bikers had sparked something deeper, a sense of unity and hope that had been missing for far too long. At Mrs. Jensen's cafe, the old woman greeted her with a warm embrace. "You've done more than you know, dear," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This neighborhood feels safe again, because of you." Emily shrugged modestly. I just did what anyone would have done. Mrs. Jensen shook her head. No, you did what needed to be done. Meanwhile, Jake found himself grappling with the consequences of his actions. His gang had disbanded, and without their loyalty, his once feared reputation crumbled into irrelevance. The police, prompted by the neighborhood's collective testimony, investigated his past activities thoroughly. Facing charges of harassment and vandalism, Jake realized there was no escaping the fallout this time. His power, built on intimidation and fear, dissolved overnight. For the first time in his life, Jake experienced what it felt like to be powerless, and he didn't like it. Weeks passed, and life slowly returned to normal. Emily continued her deliveries, still the same dedicated postwoman she had always been, but now carrying a quiet pride that couldn't be shaken. One afternoon, she found herself back on the street where the confrontation had taken place. The memory of that intense day lingered, but it no longer weighed her down. She was stronger now, not just because of her Olympic past, but because of what she had proven to herself. As she approached the familiar corner, she noticed a group of neighborhood kids practicing cartwheels and flips in the park. They waved excitedly when they saw her. "Miss Emily, look. We've been practicing our flips like you," one girl exclaimed proudly, attempting a handstand. Emily's heart swelled with warmth. "You're doing great. Keep practicing, and never give up," she encouraged. One brisk autumn morning, Emily received an official-looking letter in her mailbag. It was addressed to her not from a customer, but from the city council. Inside was an invitation to a community recognition event, honoring her for her bravery and service to the neighborhood. Stunned, Emily stared at the letter, reading the words twice to be sure. She attended the ceremony reluctantly, uncomfortable being in the spotlight after years of living a quiet life. But when she arrived, she saw familiar, friendly faces: Mrs. Jensen, the local kids, and dozens of neighbors she had quietly helped through her daily deliveries. As the mayor handed her a Medal of Community Honor, he spoke warmly, "Courage comes in many forms. Emily Dawson reminded us that true strength doesn't come from size or power, it comes from standing up when it matters most." That night, Emily sat by her fireplace, holding the community medal in her hands. Next to it rested her long-forgotten Olympic gold medal, two symbols of strength, earned in entirely different ways. Her past as a gymnast had shaped her, but it was her present as a protector, a defender of her community, that defined her now. With a deep breath, she placed both medals side by side on her mantle. She was finally at peace, not because of the recognition, but because she had reclaimed her sense of purpose. The streets she walked every day were no longer just part of her job, they were her home, her responsibility, and her legacy. And as she prepared for another day, Emily knew one thing for certain. Strength isn't measured by the battles you win in front of a crowd, it's measured by the fights you face when no one's watching. Emily walked down the familiar streets, her mailbag resting comfortably on her shoulder. The world seemed unchanged, the same quiet neighborhood, the same morning breeze, but inside, she felt entirely different. She had faced what once seemed impossible, not with brute strength, but with skill, courage, and resilience. Life had a way of testing people in unexpected ways. Some tests came in the form of competition, under the bright lights of a world stage. Others came in the form of everyday challenges, quiet battles fought without an audience, without medals, and without applause. Emily had conquered both. As she approached Mrs. Jensen's cafe, she noticed a group of young kids playing by the swings, laughing without a care in the world. A small boy struggled to climb the monkey bars, falling repeatedly but refusing to quit. Emily couldn't help but admire his determination. She saw a bit of herself in that stubborn persistence, in that refusal to be defeated. She walked over and offered a gentle tip: "Keep your grip steady. Don't rush, one bar at a time." The boy nodded, determination blazing in his eyes. With renewed focus, he reached for the next bar and made it across. His triumphant cheer echoed across the park. Emily smiled to herself. Strength wasn't about never falling, it was about always getting back up. People often judged others by what they saw on the surface, assuming, underestimating, labeling. They rarely paused to think about the hidden stories, the struggles, or the quiet victories carried by the person standing next to them. Emily knew that all too well. She had been judged, dismissed, and underestimated, only to rise above every challenge thrown her way. She had faced battles both in the arena and in life, proving that true strength wasn't about size, loudness, or bravado, it was about heart, determination, and resilience. And sometimes, it was about knowing when to speak and when to let your actions do the talking. Emily's journey wasn't just about her past as a gymnast or her victory against the bikers. It was about something much deeper, about standing up when it mattered most, even when no one was watching. She had shown her neighborhood that bravery comes in many forms. It can be quiet, steady, and even invisible until the moment it's needed. And when that moment comes, it can change everything. Emily didn't need recognition or awards. She didn't need anyone to know her story. What mattered was that she had reclaimed her strength, not just for herself, but for her community, and in doing so, she had become something far greater than she ever imagined. As she continued her route, she thought back to all the moments she had been overlooked, ignored, or dismissed. Those moments had once felt like burdens, but now she saw them for what they truly were: opportunities. Being underestimated was its own kind of power. It gave her the element of surprise, the chance to rise when no one expected it. And when she rose with unstoppable force. People often feared being overlooked, but Emily had learned to embrace it. After all, it wasn't the loudest voice that commanded the most respect, it was the one that spoke with action, purpose, and strength. Before finishing her route, Emily paused by the community message board near the park. She pinned a small, handwritten note to the board, its message simple but powerful. Remember this: true strength isn't about winning battles in front of a crowd. It's about standing tall when no one's watching. She stepped back, letting the wind carry the words forward. The note wasn't meant for anyone in particular, but perhaps, someday, someone who needed it would read it and feel inspired. As she walked away, the sun cast a warm glow over the street, illuminating the familiar path ahead. Emily didn't know what challenges the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She was ready. Because in a world that often judged by appearances, she had proven that strength wasn't always visible, and that sometimes, the quietest person in the room was the one you should never underestimate. With each step she took, Emily carried more than letters. She carried a story of resilience, courage, and the power of never backing down. And as she disappeared down the street, her silhouette fading into the horizon, one truth remained clear. You never know who's standing right in front of you until they show you exactly what they're made of.